The fluorescent lights hummed overhead like a mechanical heartbeat as Laura Bennett pushed through the ER doors at 6:13 a.m., her badge catching the harsh white glow. The morning shift at Seattle General stretched before her, identical to the 342 shifts that came before it, a landscape of vitals to check, force to replace, invisible work performed by invisible hands. She kept her head down, moving through the corridors with the kind of efficiency that nobody noticed because it was designed not to be noticed. Her scrubs were pale blue, faded from 200 washes, and they hung on her frame like camouflage. The emergency department was already coming alive. A diabetic grandmother in Bay 1 needed her glucose recheck. The construction worker in Bay 3 had a laceration that required fresh gauze. An elderly man with pneumonia was running a fever that climbed steadily toward 103. Laura moved between them with economical precision, her hand steady despite the tremor she allowed others to see, the one that made her seem fragile, worried, deferential, exactly what a nurse was supposed to be. She checked the grandmother's blood sugar, 247. Not terrible. She made a note on the chart and moved on without comment. The chart would speak for her. Charts always did. At the nurse's station, Dr. Pierce watched her over the rim of his coffee mug. He was the ER director, a title he wore like a military general wore stars, which meant he believed it granted him dominion over everything that moved, breathed, or bled in this department. His eyes followed her as she walked, tracking her movements with the focused attention of someone hunting for weakness. What he saw was exactly what she intended him to see, a competent but unremarkable nurse, the kind who did her work quietly and never asked questions. The kind who understood her place. His fingers drummed against a stack of billing reports on the desk, a rhythm like distant artillery, and he smiled to himself, the smile of a man who had already decided what he thought he knew about someone. Laura entered Bay 3 where the construction worker lay waiting. His name was Marcus, according to the chart. 41 years old. Deep laceration on his left forearm sustained when a piece of rebar shifted during a pour. He watched her approach with the careful attention of someone accustomed to pain. She unwrapped the old gauze with practiced care, revealing the wound, clean edges, no active bleeding, the kind of injury that would tell a story for years. She reached for the suture kit without hesitation, her movements carrying a precision that belonged to a different world entirely, a world of operating tents and moonlit compounds and wounds that meant something far heavier than workplace accidents. Her needle entry was exact. Second intercostal space, no, wait. Wrong anatomy. That was from another lifetime. This was forearm tissue, subcutaneous layer, simple approximation. Her angle was 45 degrees, the depth consistent, the spacing economical. No wasted movement. No hesitation. Every tie-off was tight enough to hold, loose enough not to strangle tissue. The kind of suturing taught only to surgeons who operated under fire, who understood that speed and precision were not opposites but lovers, dancing together in the dark. Marcus watched her hands move. He said nothing, but something shifted in his face, recognition, maybe, or the ghost of recognition. He had been an army medic once, attached to a reconnaissance team in Helmand Province, and he had seen combat surgeons work in conditions that would break normal people. He had seen what special forces medicine looked like. It looked like this. It looked like hands that had held lives together in the sand and dust, hands that moved like water finding its path. He almost said something, but he didn't. Some things didn't need words. Laura tied off the final stitch and stepped back. 14 stitches. They would hold. She dressed the wound with clean gauze and secured it with medical tape, her movements flowing into one another like water, like muscle memory, like something her body had learned so long ago that her conscious mind didn't have to participate anymore. She removed her gloves, the snapping sound echoed against the tile, and placed them in the biohazard container with the same care she would have used handling ordnance. She documented everything in the chart. Every observation. Every vital sign. The kind of notes that a medic would write, precise and specific, because precision kept people alive. "You're all set," she said to Marcus, her voice kept low and deferential, the voice of someone who understood hierarchy. "Dr. Pierce will check the closure before you're discharged." You ever work combat? Marcus asked quietly. Laura paused. The question hung in the air between them like something solid. She didn't answer. She simply turned and walked out of the bay, her shoulders straight but not too straight, her posture suggesting nothing but the weight of another ordinary morning. Behind her, Marcus watched her go, and he understood that the question had been answered in the silence. The break room smelled like stale coffee and the particular staleness of a space where hope came to die slowly. Laura opened her locker, number 247, she had never forgotten, never would forget, and her fingers found the worn jacket hanging in the back. It was old leather, scuffed and creased, the color of something that had seen real weather. She touched the lining without opening the jacket fully, her fingertips finding the edge of something sewn there with precision stitches. A patch. Faded green. A unit designation that meant nothing to anyone in this hospital, everything to her. She let her hand rest there for a moment, her jaw tightening slightly, and then she closed the locker door. The sound of the lock clicking was like a vault ceiling. Down the corridor, at the nurse's station, Dr. Pierce was in conversation with two of the attending physicians. His voice carried the particular tone of someone sharing valuable intelligence, the tone of a man constructing something. He had a file open on his computer, and the physicians were leaning in, reading something. Billing reports. Imaging orders. Patterns that had started to trouble him, not because he cared about unnecessary scans, but because someone else had noticed the patterns first. Laura had noticed them 3 weeks ago. She had been transcribing orders, routine administrative work that should have required no thought at all, when something in the rhythm had caught her attention. 17 CT scans in the previous month, all ordered by the 3 highest-paid physicians in the department. 17 scans for presentations that could have been managed with simple radiographs. 17 scans billed to Medicare at an average of $2,847 each. The math had done itself. Dr. Pierce drove a Mercedes. Dr. Herriman drove a Tesla. Dr. Kozlov had just bought a house in the historic district that listed at $1.2 million. She had made a simple observation to Dr. Pierce one afternoon. Nothing confrontational, nothing accusatory, the imaging orders seem elevated this month. It was the kind of comment that should have gone nowhere. It was the kind of comment that nurses were supposed to keep to themselves, suggestions that they knew their place, which was silent. But Dr. Pierce had heard the implication underneath. He had heard the question embedded in the observation, why? And he had decided, in that moment, with the kind of instantaneous certainty that comes only to men accustomed to unchallenged authority, that Laura Bennett had crossed a line that she would regret crossing. Now he was photocopying evidence. Building a case. The way you built a case against someone you had already decided was the problem, rather than someone who had simply asked what everyone else was too afraid to ask. Laura moved through the department like a ghost who had remembered, finally, that ghosts were invisible by definition. She checked blood pressures. She replaced 4 bags. She held the hand of an elderly man whose daughter wasn't there yet, wasn't going to come, and she understood that too, understood what it meant to be abandoned, what it meant to be forgotten. But that wasn't the worst part. What happened next would change everything in ways she couldn't have anticipated, not yet, not until the rain came and the doors burst open and the world she had carefully, painfully rebuilt would begin to crack open from the inside. It was 8:42 a.m. when the first real crisis began, though nobody recognized it yet. The waiting room was filling, fever cases, complaints, the usual Thursday morning population. And outside, in the parking lot, a man was having thoughts that would reshape the morning into something neither he nor anyone else would ever forget. The waiting room was filling, fever cases, complaints, the usual Thursday morning population. And somewhere in the hospital's upper corridors, Dr. Pierce was preparing a lecture that would change everything. Grand rounds happened at 10 o'clock sharp every Thursday in Conference Room B, a sterile box with 16 grey chairs arranged in 3 rows facing a podium. By the time the 20 residents filtered in, shuffling coffee cups and laptops, Laura had already finished her morning vitals checks and was restocking the supply stations, her movements efficient and forgettable. She'd learned long ago how to move through Seattle General like a ghost, present but unseen, competent but invisible. It was safer that way. It kept her unremarkable. It kept her off the radar. Dr. Pierce had other plans. She didn't hear the summons the first time. A resident found her near the medication dispensary at 9:27 a.m. "Dr. Pierce wants you in conference room B," the young doctor said, already turning away. "Before grand rounds. Now." Laura set down the 4 solutions she was holding and walked downstairs. The fluorescent lights cast everything in their institutional white glow, the kind of light that made the world feel medical and hostile at once. Her hands were steady as she climbed the stairs. Her breathing was controlled. She'd been in worse rooms than this. Dr. Pierce stood at the podium in his starched white coat, the fabric so crisp it looked like it could cut. He was a man built on the architecture of entitlement, 6'2", with the kind of jaw that had probably gotten him into medical school on charisma alone, paired with a father's connections and a last name that appeared on a hospital wing. He'd been at Seattle General for 17 years, and his reputation was constructed from a mixture of clinical competence and something darker, a talent for making people feel small. "Ms. Bennett," he said, not looking up from his notes. "Stand at the front. Let's discuss appropriate boundaries. No question. No explanation. An order delivered like a command to a subordinate." Laura positioned herself at the podium's left, her hands folded, her expression blank. She'd learned how to occupy space without taking up room, a technique that had served her well in emergency departments and, before that, in places where visibility could be fatal. The residents began arriving at exactly 9:52 a.m. 23 of them, ranging from first-year medical students to PGY3 residents, all carrying the particular arrogance that came with wearing a coat that said doctor on the front. They settled into their chairs, opening laptops, pulling out notebooks. The room smelled of coffee and the faint, distinctive odor of antiseptic hand gel that never quite washed away. Someone coughed. A keyboard clacked. Dr. Pierce adjusted his tie and began. "Let's talk about the chain of command," he said, his voice dropping into the register he reserved for teachable moments, warm on the surface, with an edge underneath like a blade wrapped in silk. "Medicine is not a democracy. It is a hierarchy. Nurses are essential, of course. We couldn't function without them. But essential doesn't mean autonomous. Essential doesn't mean their role is to question clinical judgment." Laura's jaw tightened slightly. Just barely. Barely enough to feel, not enough to see. Recently, Dr. Pierce continued, Nurse Bennett here expressed concerns about the volume of CT scans ordered in our department. Specifically, she questioned whether certain imaging protocols aligned with clinical necessity. He paused for effect, and the pause was poisonous. She seemed to believe that her nursing background qualified her to second-guess physician decision-making. A few residents exchanged glances. One tried to hide a smile behind his coffee cup. "The reason we have protocols," Dr. Pierce said, walking slowly across the front of the room, "is so that individuals don't make decisions based on incomplete information. Nurses observe. Physicians diagnose. Nurses execute. Physicians determine. This isn't ego. This isn't arrogance. This is the structure that keeps patients alive." 8 minutes. That was how long he spoke. 8 minutes of variations on the same theme, each iteration a little sharper, a little more pointed. Florence Nightingale came out twice, both times with careful sarcasm that made half the room smile. He described nurses who overstepped their boundaries as if describing a particular species of incompetence. He painted a picture of a profession so desperate for relevance that they invented problems that didn't exist so that they could feel important. The worst part wasn't the words. It was the way every resident in that room had their eyes on her, watching for a reaction, waiting to see if she would crumble under the weight of public humiliation. That was the point, she understood. That was always the point. Shame was a tool, and it worked best when applied in front of witnesses. When Dr. Pierce finally finished, he turned to her with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Thank you for this opportunity to reinforce these principles, Ms. Bennett. I hope our residents have learned something today." The silence that followed lasted exactly 3 seconds. Then someone started typing. Someone else shifted in their chair. Laura met his eyes. Her expression was flat, completely still, not angry, not hurt, not defensive. Just a cold, measured gaze that could have belonged to a woman looking at a spreadsheet or a machine that needed adjusting. When she spoke, her voice was surgical and precise, each word dropping like a scalpel. Strange how the scans you flag as critical always happen to be the most profitable ones. The typing stopped. The ones that require contrast. The ones that generate referral kickbacks. The ones that happen to correlate exactly with your partner's new Mercedes. She paused, her eyes never leaving his. Wonder if anyone's looked at the actual medical necessity rates. Wonder what Medicare audit would find. Dr. Pierce's face flushed a particular shade of burgundy that made one of the residents actually put down their phone. Laura turned and walked away. Just walked, her footsteps steady and even as she moved toward the door. Behind her, she heard him start to speak, something about insubordination, about respecting his authority, but his voice had lost its edge. It sounded like sputtering. It sounded like air escaping from something that had just been punctured. The residents didn't move. Nobody said anything. The silence in that room had a weight to it, the kind of silence that comes right after something has broken and nobody's quite sure what to do about the pieces. Dr. Pierce stood at the podium, his note still in his hand, his jaw working soundlessly for a moment. Then he set the papers down with careful precision, and his hands were shaking. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part came 4 hours later, when Laura was at the vending machine on the third-floor corridor, feeding dollar bills into a machine that was humming the particular song of broken American technology. Dr. Pierce appeared beside her without announcement, standing close enough that she could smell the cologne he wore, expensive, sharp, the kind of scent that was trying to say something about the man wearing it. "Careful, Florence," he said quietly, and his voice had shifted into something different now, something with less volume but more precision, like he'd decided that public humiliation had failed and strategic operations were required. "I've been documenting every mistake you make. Every deviation from protocol. Every time you step outside your lane." He paused, and she could feel the shape of his smile without turning to look at it. "One more boundary violation and security will escort you out of this building. Do you understand me?" Laura selected her selection, B7, black coffee, because she'd learned never to want anything, and waited for the machine to dispense it. "I have 17 years here," Pierce continued. "I have relationships. I have documentation. I have a lawyer on speed dial. You have a high school diploma and a RN license that I can make disappear before lunch. So I suggest you remember who you work for." The machine hummed. The coffee fell. "Yes, doctor," Laura said quietly, her voice deferential and soft, the way she'd learned to speak in this hospital, in this particular ecosystem. She took the coffee and turned away, walking back down the corridor without acknowledging his presence further. But something had shifted in that moment. Dr. Pierce had revealed his strategy, and his strategy was institutional power, the kind of leverage that came from being someone who belonged here, from having documentation trails and lawyer names and relationships that would outlast any individual complaint. That was his source of control. He couldn't be touched because he was too connected, too documented, too necessary. That afternoon, around 3:15 p.m., he pulled her into his office. The office was the kind that said money, a corner room with 2 windows overlooking Savannah, a desk that looked like hardwood but cost more than a car, 3 degrees framed on the wall from institutions that probably still remembered when he'd been a competent surgeon before he discovered that billing was easier than healing. He sat behind the desk, his hands folded on its surface, and he pulled a single sheet of paper from a folder that was already thick with documentation. "Written warning," he said, and he didn't look angry anymore, which was worse than anger. He looked satisfied. Failure to respect physician authority. Insubordination during grand rounds. Making unfounded accusations about clinical decision-making. He slid the paper across the desk with 2 fingers, the way someone might slide away something contaminated. "Sign it." "Both copies." Laura picked up the pen from his desk, a Mont Blanc, probably another statement, and signed both copies without reading them. Her signature was precise and controlled, the handwriting of someone who understood that signatures were contracts with herself. "You understand," Dr. Pierce said, watching her sign, "that this is the first documented step. 3 of these, and you're terminated. I'm going to get there. Whether it takes 2 months or 3 is really up to you." She placed the pen down gently on the desk and stood. The office chair squeaked slightly as she moved away from it. Outside the windows, Savannah was going about its Thursday afternoon business, and she was about to join it, and Dr. Pierce was already reaching for his phone to make the next call in whatever campaign he was building. That was when the army medic appeared in the doorway. His name was Patterson. She'd seen his chart that morning, a 64-year-old admitted overnight for observation after a fall. He was still wearing his hospital gown, his weathered face carrying the kind of lines that came from a lifetime of looking at hard things. He stood in the doorway, not entering, just standing there, his eyes moving between Laura and Pierce with the kind of assessment a soldier makes about a tactical situation. "Excuse me," he said quietly, his voice the low register of someone used to being obeyed. "Is there a problem here?" Dr. Pierce's smile tightened. "Patient relations matter is being handled. You need to return to your room." Patterson's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. His eye stayed on Laura for a moment longer, and in that moment, something passed between them, recognition, maybe, or understanding. The kind of understanding that came from people who had learned to read danger in small movements and quiet spaces. "Yes, sir," Patterson said finally, but he didn't move immediately. He stood there another moment, cataloguing details, the way soldiers do. Then he turned and walked back toward the hallway, his gait slower than it should have been for a man of his fitness level, like he was making sure Laura saw him memorizing the route to Dr. Pierce's office. The door closed quietly. Dr. Pierce returned to his paperwork, already moving on to the next task, the next name, the next strategic operation in whatever campaign he was building. Laura picked up her copy of the written warning and walked out of the office, back into the hallway with its institutional lighting and its smell of antiseptic and its particular kind of hospital silence. She didn't know yet that this warning was the beginning. She didn't know that Dr. Pierce had been documenting imaginary mistakes for weeks, building a file that would be thick with falsehoods by the time it mattered. She didn't know that Patterson was already analyzing every detail he'd witnessed, already understanding something that would become critical in 4 days. All she knew was that she'd spoken truth and been punished for it, and that the punishment was designed to be the first step of a longer destruction. And somewhere in the waiting room downstairs, the Thursday afternoon patients were still arriving with their fevers and complaints and ordinary emergencies, while a man with a past and violent thoughts was having realizations that would change the shape of the morning into something neither he nor anyone else would ever forget. Rain hammered the parking lot like applause that wouldn't stop. Tuesday afternoon at Seattle General, the kind of gray that made you forget what sunlight looked like. Inside the waiting room, fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting everyone in that sickly institutional pallor. The vending machine hummed its mechanical song. 3 minutes past 2. The homeless veteran came through the sliding doors like something the storm had spit out. His name was Thomas Garrett. No one would know that yet. He was 63, though he looked 80, his face the color of concrete, his breathing wrong, asymmetrical, labored, one side of his chest heaving while the other barely moved. He'd been living in the botanical gardens for 4 months. Nobody asked why. He collapsed against the intake desk, hand clutching his left ribs, and the waiting room held its breath. Laura was in the medication bay, restocking the crash cart with the methodical precision of someone who'd done this same motion 10,000 times. For lines organized by gauge. Epinephrine pre-filled syringes arranged smallest to largest. Defibrillator pads checked and dated. She heard the commotion through the open doorway, the intake clerk's voice rising, someone calling for a nurse, the wet slap of the man hitting linoleum. She didn't move quickly. She never moved quickly in front of witnesses. But her hands already knew what her brain had registered from sound alone. Tension pneumothorax. Collapsed lung with a trap between the lung membrane and chest wall, increasing pressure with every breath, compressing the heart and opposite lung. The clinical term was simple. The result was death in minutes. She moved through the doorway. 3 nurses were frozen around the veteran like marble statues. The intake clerk was fumbling for the phone. The man's lips were turning grey. His breathing sounded like wind through a broken window, high, desperate, incomplete. His skin was cool and tacky with sweat. His pupils were dilating. Laura knelt beside him without speaking. She placed her hand on his left chest wall just below the collarbone, feeling the asymmetry, confirming what she already knew. Air hissing through tissues that shouldn't have air. Pressure building. His eyes found hers, and she saw the navy tattoo on his inner left wrist, an anchor with the letters SEAL Team 3. "Can't breathe," he whispered. "I know," she said. "I'm going to fix it." She moved to the crash cart without waiting for permission. 14-gauge angiocath needle. 8 centimeters long. She'd practiced this procedure 500 times on cadavers and simulation dummies, but that wasn't where muscle memory comes from. Muscle memory comes from Helmand Province at 2 in the morning with rounds incoming and a Marine's lung collapsed and your hands knowing exactly what to do because your hands have already done it while IEDs were still detonating in the distance. The veteran's shirt was already off. His ribs were stark shadows beneath papery skin. She found the second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line. Her fingers marked the anatomy like reading a map written in bone. The other nurses were watching now, watching her, none of them moving toward help or equipment or anything at all. They watched like she was a stranger performing miracles. She didn't explain. No time. She prepped the site with an alcohol swab, the smell of it sharp and clinical, cutting through the copper of old blood and the yeast ferment smell of homeless living. She positioned the needle. 22 millimeters of gauge between a man and death. The needle went in at a 90-degree angle, sliding between ribs with a sensation like cutting through leather. The hiss came. That's what they teach you in the books, listen for the hiss of air escaping. What the books don't tell you is how it sounds, like a tire deflating, like the world letting out a breath it's been holding. His eyes widened. His breathing changed. Not better yet. Better would take a chest tube and positive pressure and a surgeon, but the immediate catastrophe stopped catastrophizing. His oxygen saturation was climbing. The pressure on his heart releasing. She could see it in his face, the change from drowning to gasping to actual breath. "Need a chest tube," she said. Her voice had dropped an octave. Not a question. Not a request. One of the nurses moved. Actually moved. Found the phone. Called for a trauma surgeon on call. Called for the OR to stand by. The veteran's breathing was still wrong, still labored, but it was breathing. His color was improving. His pulse coming down from the red line. He looked at Laura with something between gratitude and recognition, like he'd seen her somewhere before, and maybe he had, maybe in some forward operating base in the Hindu Kush where a special forces surgeon had operated on wounded men with bullet holes and shattered bones, hands moving with the terrifying precision of someone who'd done this while explosions rattled the tin walls. "Easy," Laura said. "Surgeon's coming. You're stable." She didn't notice Dr. Pierce standing in the archway. Didn't notice him filming on his phone. Didn't notice the expression on his face that was already calculating, already weaponizing, already building the narrative he would tell to risk management and legal and the chief medical officer. She was focused on the veteran's rising oxygen saturation, 68, now 72, now 78, and the normalization of his breathing, and the fact that she'd just saved a man's life using a procedure that wasn't in any protocol he would list in the formal complaint. Unauthorized access to crash cart supplies. Check. Invasive procedure without physician supervision. Check. Performing duties outside the scope of a registered nurse. Check. He had it all on video. The next minutes blurred into efficiency, the trauma surgeon arriving, examining the site, nodding with professional approval, saying something about good field medicine, ordering a stat chest tube and imaging. The veteran was wheeled toward the operating rooms, and Laura stayed in the waiting room, cleaning the space where he'd collapsed, wiping away blood and sweat with careful motions. Her hands were steady. They were always steady. The trembling was something other people did, something she'd trained out of herself 15 years ago when trembling meant death. She was throwing the bloody supplies into biohazard when Dr. Pierce approached. He was smiling. That was the worst part, not anger, not fury, but satisfaction. "We need to talk," he said. "In my office. Now." It wasn't a request. It was a command delivered with the confidence of someone holding a loaded weapon. Laura folded the paper towel once, twice, 3 times, making it into something compact and manageable. When she spoke, her voice was completely flat. "After I clock out." "Now," he repeated. She turned and looked at him directly. Not defiance. Just evaluation, the way you'd look at a patient's imaging to understand the damage. "I said after I clock out, doctor." He opened his mouth, closed it, turned and walked away. She heard him on his phone within seconds, his voice urgent and precise. The email to risk management would arrive in 4 minutes, complete with video timestamps and a paper trail of previous concerns that he was still fabricating in real time. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was waiting in the break room with her phone dark and her shift ending and no idea that the machinery had already been set in motion. That by Friday morning, there would be a disciplinary panel. That by Friday afternoon, there would be termination papers on a mahogany desk, pushed across with the casual cruelty of a man who didn't realize he was looking at the ghost of a captain who'd once called down airstrikes on her position to protect her team. That the only thing stopping her from ending his career permanently was the fact that she'd taken an oath to protect her identity, to vanish into the civilian world, to be small and quiet and invisible. She clocked out at 6:43 p.m. Rain was still hammering the parking lot. Somewhere in the hospital, a man with a Navy SEAL tattoo was being prepped for surgery, his lung being reinflated by someone who had no idea who'd just saved his life. And somewhere in his office, Dr. Pierce was documenting crimes that had never happened, building a case against someone he'd never bothered to actually see. Within hours, Dr. Pierce's office became a documentary of fabrication. 20 pages. Highlighted margins. Cross-reference timestamps that didn't exist. He built his case the way architects build fortresses, not with truth, but with the appearance of precision. 3 violations, each one meticulously typed across hospital letterhead, performing invasive procedures without physician authorization, accessing crash cart medications independently, failure to wait for attending physician assessment. The words looked damning when you didn't know they were lies. When you didn't know that every protocol she'd violated had saved a man's life. He pulled the surveillance footage on Wednesday afternoon, rewinding the tape of the waiting room collapse, watching Laura's hands move with the kind of fluid certainty that made him uneasy. The footage didn't lie, but he could arrange what people saw. He isolated the moment she reached for the needle. Froze the frame. Printed it. Added it to the stack. Somewhere between the 4th and 5th fabricated incident report, he began to convince himself that he wasn't destroying her, he was protecting his department. His authority. The way things were supposed to work. The disciplinary panel convened Thursday morning in a conference room that smelled like burnt coffee and institutional decision-making. 2 hospital administrators sat across from him, their expressions polite and bureaucratic. Pierce presented his documentation with the confidence of a man holding a winning hand. He tapped each page against the table like a conductor marking tempo. Pattern of insubordination. Repeated protocol violations. Safety concerns. The administrators nodded along, barely scanning the papers, their attention already pivoting toward lunch meetings and budget meetings and all the other meetings that comprised their days. Laura arrived Friday morning at 7:15, 10 minutes early, which meant she'd already known what was coming. The windowless conference room occupied the hospital's northeast corner, one of those spaces designed to contain human misery efficiently. Fluorescent panels hummed overhead. A laminate table the color of hospital beige. 3 chairs on one side, one on the other, arranged like a courtroom sketch. Pierce sat in the middle, flanked by the HR director and the chief of staff, all of them watching as Laura walked in without hesitation, her movements economical, her face a blank slate that gave nothing away. She sat down. Pierce slid a folder across the table, its edges aligned with geometric precision. Inside lay his 20 pages of fabricated concerns, each one cross-referenced, dated, notarized with the weight of institutional authority. He spoke for 11 minutes without stopping. His voice carried the tone of a man reciting scripture, absolute certainty that what he was saying mattered, that he was the keeper of standards, that she had fundamentally violated the order of things. Miss Bennett has repeatedly demonstrated she cannot function within established protocols, he concluded, his fingertips pressed together in a pyramid. This institution depends on hierarchy, on structure, on nurses knowing their place. You crossed that line. Multiple times. Deliberately. The HR director didn't make eye contact. We're terminating your employment effective immediately, she said, sliding termination papers across the table. Your final paycheck includes severance through the end of the month. There will be no reference provided. Pierce pushed the papers the final 6 inches himself, his eyes watching for the crack in her composure he'd been waiting for since the moment she questioned his CT scans. His smile was barely concealed satisfaction, the expression of a man who'd finally eliminated a problem. Laura picked up the pen. Her hand was absolutely steady. She signed her name on 3 separate documents, each signature identical in its precision, the kind of penmanship that came from years of documenting medical records where mistakes cost lives. She slid the papers back across the table without speaking. Pierce's smile faltered. He'd expected tears. Anger. Some kind of emotional collapse that would validate his decision, that would prove she was unstable, that would confirm he'd done the right thing. Instead, she stood up, unbuttoned her hospital ID badge, set it on the table, and walked out of the room. Security didn't escort her. That would have looked bad on paper, so Pierce had arranged for her to leave alone, which felt like a courtesy and was actually another small cruelty disguised as kindness. She could feel the weight of stares as she walked through the emergency department toward her locker in the nurse's break room. Colleagues pretended not to watch. The army medic, Patterson, she remembered his name was Patterson, looked away as she passed, but his jaw tightened in a way that suggested he understood something was wrong. The locker was small, utilitarian. Sneakers, a cardigan, her personal medical textbook on emergency surgical procedures, a photo of her from civilian life, her blonde hair, smiling at a farmer's market in Seattle, taken 9 years ago when she'd still believed she could disappear. She packed it all into a canvas bag with the same methodical precision she applied to everything. When she was finished, she walked to the laundry supervisor's office on the basement level. The supervisor was a Navy veteran named Holloway, someone who'd served on a carrier strike group and had learned to recognize military bearing in the way people moved. Laura handed over her 3 pairs of scrubs, folded with hospital corners, the kind of fold that came from field medic training where cleanliness was discipline and discipline was survival. The pale blue fabric was creased into perfect geometric edges. Holloway looked at the fold. Then at Laura's face. Then at the fold again. You served, he said. It wasn't a question. Different life, Laura replied. Thank you for the work. She didn't wait for a response. She walked up the stairs, out through the staff entrance, past the security checkpoint where no one asked for her ID because she wasn't anyone anymore. Her car was parked in the northwest lot, the Toyota Camry that was the definition of civilian invisibility. She drove home through rain, the kind of Savannah rain that fell sideways and made the world feel like it was drowning in slow motion. Her apartment was sparse. Furnished like a hotel room. No pictures on the walls. No evidence of occupancy. She sat on the couch staring at the jacket hanging in the closet, the one with the faded unit patch sewn inside the lining, hidden where no one would ever look. The patch showed the emblem of the 1st Special Forces Operational Detachment Delta, her unit, her identity, the part of her the Pentagon had ordered erased from every database, every record, every official account. Captain Laura Bennett no longer existed. The next morning, Saturday, she returned to Seattle General Staff entrance and walked into the laundry office. Holloway looked up from his paperwork. Came to say goodbye, Laura said. He nodded slowly, understanding what that probably cost. Where you headed? Somewhere quiet. She turned to leave, then stopped. If anyone asks, tell them I was just a nurse. That's not what you were, Holloway said. But she was already gone. 3 days passed in the kind of civilian limbo that felt like drowning on dry land. Tuesday afternoon, she sat in her apartment listening to rain against the windows, wondering if she'd ever been anything real or if the last 18 years had been a hallucination. She pulled up the news on her phone out of habit, scrolling through headlines about local accidents and municipal politics and all the small human dramas that filled the spaces between major events. Then she saw the alert, emergency at Seattle General. Multiple injuries. Active threat situation. Security lockdown. Her phone didn't ring. No one called. She was a civilian now. Whatever was happening at that hospital had nothing to do with her. She closed the browser and went back to her apartment walls. But her hands had already started moving. 3 days of rain hammered Savannah like a judgment. Laura sat in her apartment on East 47th Street watching the downpour streak the windows, her hands folded on the kitchen table like a prayer she no longer knew how to speak. The termination papers sat in a folder. Her certification, laminated and useless. A dozen rejection emails from other hospitals. Pierce had worked the phone lines, made calls, whispered things to people he'd gone to medical school with. She was toxic now. Radioactive. The kind of nurse who didn't respect hierarchy, who created workplace conflict, who failed to follow protocol. The words stung not because they were true but because they were perfectly crafted lies. But her hands had already started moving. A news alert hit her phone at 2:38 p.m. on day 3. Active medical emergency at Seattle General. Multiple patients in waiting room. Response units dispatched. She didn't know why she looked. Didn't know why she clicked the link, read the words, saw the location. The old instinct woke up inside her like muscle memory, like something that never actually slept. She was in her car before she consciously decided to go, wet scrubs stuffed in the back seat, still folded from the day she'd handed them over to Holloway in the laundry room. 23 minutes to the hospital. She drove 127 miles per hour on Route 9 and didn't brake. The rain felt like applause on the windshield. The ER entrance was chaos. She saw it before she saw anything else, the rotor wash of anxiety, the trembling pressure of a room full of people experiencing the exact same spike of adrenaline at the exact same moment. Bodies scrambling backward. A woman in a yellow rain jacket knocked over 3 chairs, stumbling toward the back hallway, dragging her 2 children. The security guards had their hands on their belts, fingers hovering near pepper spray, radios crackling in competing frequencies. The automatic doors hung open like a mouth, and standing in the threshold was 7 feet of rage wearing a hospital gown and wild, unfocused eyes. The man screamed something in Pashto. Not words, sounds. Guttural roars that came from the back of a throat built for screaming in deserts. His knife was a Kershaw combat utility, 3.6-inch blade, the kind you could buy at any sporting goods store, which meant he'd planned this with at least enough forethought to acquire a weapon, which meant this wasn't random decompensation, this was targeting. His shirt was torn at the shoulder. Fresh stitches, maybe 6 hours old. Withdrawal or infection, probably. The body in free fall. The mind following. Everyone else was running. Laura walked toward him. Not fast. Not slow. The kind of forward motion that belongs to people who've walked into worse, who've crossed killing fields with the same tempo, who understand that speed telegraphs fear and fear telegraphs threat and threat telegraphs escalation. She moved through the scattered chairs like they were choreography she already knew. 15 feet between them. 10. 8. Salam, she said, and her voice dropped an octave from the one she'd been using, the deferential voice, the nurse voice. This voice belonged to someone else. I'm Laura. What's your name? The man's eyes snapped to her. Bloodshot. Pupils like pinpricks. Dilated and constricted at war with each other, the mark of a nervous system that had been chemically rearranged and set on fire. You don't know me, he said in Pashto. His knife hand was shaking. You run. Everyone runs. Not everyone, she replied in his language, and something shifted in his face. A fracture in the rage. A moment where the human underneath tried to surface through the chemical storm. She was 3 feet away now. She could see the scar tissue on his left forearm, blast shrapnel, embedded then dug out, probably in a field hospital that was nothing more than a room with a generator and someone with steady hands. She could see his hands, and she recognized something in the tremor that wasn't fear but withdrawal. Oxycodone, maybe. Or morphine. Something his body had learned to crave in a place where morphine was the only mercy available. The American surgeon, he whispered, and the knife dropped to the floor like it had lost the ability to stay in his hand. Sheaton. The devil. You were in Helmand. Sanjan Valley. You saved my brother when he was bleeding out in a compound. You operated on a dying boy with bombs falling outside. The room went dead silent. Security guards froze. The woman in the yellow jacket stopped running and turned around. The fluorescent lights hummed their electric hymn, indifferent to revelation. You don't need the knife, Laura said quietly. You need a bed. You need withdrawal management. You need someone to listen. His legs gave out before he hit the ground. He was weeping by the time his knees found the tile, the weapon clattering against the linoleum with a sound like forgiveness. Rubber gloves snapped. Someone was calling a code. A Marine colonel waiting for a knee checkup was standing up, pulling out his phone, scrolling with the deliberate precision of someone who knew exactly where to look. Captain Laura Bennett, the colonel read aloud, his voice carrying the weight of ceremony. Silver Star, for extracting 12 wounded soldiers under sustained enemy fire while providing emergency surgical intervention in a non-secure zone, Helmand Province, 2011. He looked up from his phone. His eyes found hers across the waiting room. My God. We knew you existed. They said your record was sealed. Dr. Pierce shoved through the crowd like he was pushing through fog. Unauthorized personnel in the ER, he shouted, his voice cracking with a rage that sounded almost defensive. This is a secure facility. I'm calling security to remove this individual. We don't allow civilians to conduct interviews with patients. The 2-star general arriving for a routine appointment that apparently had been scheduled weeks ago, that apparently nobody on staff had thought to mention, looked at Pierce with the expression of a man watching an insect make noise in the background. Shut your mouth, doctor, the general said. It wasn't a request. It wasn't negotiable. It was the kind of command voice that makes the oxygen in the room compress into smaller molecules. A security guard approached, holding something dark and folded. A jacket. Laura's jacket. The one she'd worn home from her last shift, the one she'd never come back for because she'd been escorted out by 3 p.m. The guard held it out, and pinned to the inner lining, barely visible unless you were looking, was the faded Special Forces unit patch. The scroll D with the dagger. The words, De Represso Liber. To liberate from oppression. The patch that meant she'd been through the qualification course at Fort Bragg, the pipeline, the 3-week mountain phase that separated people who could handle pressure from people who merely thought they could. The guard saluted her. Just once. Fist to chest. The sound was like thunder in a small space. Pierce's face cycled through colors like a traffic light malfunction. Purple. Gray. Back to purple. His hand started moving, explaining, justifying, attempting to reframe this through the only lens he had, which was policy and procedure and the rigid certainty that rules were his weapon and his shield. This is irrelevant to hospital operations, he stammered. That patch doesn't supersede. A laptop opened. Connor Davis, the hospital IT specialist, a Navy veteran with the kind of quiet authority that came from having spent 3 years running server clusters in a combat support hospital in Kandahar, didn't look up from his screen. Dr. Pierce, Davis said, I have every frame of security footage you deleted from the system last week. I have the timestamps you altered on Nurse Bennett's personnel file. I have the patient complaints you fabricated from your office computer on March 14th, 15th, and 16th. I have the IP logs. I have the metadata. I also have your correspondence with Apex Medical Imaging regarding the kickback arrangement for unnecessary CT scans, the Medicare fraud you've been running for 4 years. The general made a phone call. It took 20 minutes. JAG officers arrived at 4:03 p.m., credentials in hand, expressions suggesting they'd seen this movie before. They spoke to the hospital administrators in the corner office for 37 minutes. Security took Pierce's badge at 4:41 p.m. His hands were shaking too hard to hold it steady. The Afghan man, Khalid, he said his name was, wept when he told Laura about her brother, about the afternoon when mortars fell on a compound and Laura had walked in with a surgical mask and steady hands, operating on a dying kid with fire falling from the sky, operating because someone had to, because the alternative was burying a body, because that's what warriors did when everything else had failed. I prayed for you, Khalid said. For 10 years, I prayed for you. Laura's voice remained level. Professional. The voice of someone who understood that showing anything else might shatter the moment into smaller, sharper pieces. I was ordered to disappear, she said. Officially, I don't exist. But the rain kept falling, and inside Seattle General, everything was changing. 6 weeks dissolved into a new configuration. The hospital board issued a formal written apology, restored her position, added back pay, $14,000 that appeared in her account on a Thursday morning while she was making rounds. Pierce pleaded guilty to federal charges, Medicare fraud, insurance fraud, falsifying medical records, conspiracy to defraud the United States government. His medical license was permanently revoked. He was sentenced to 18 months in federal prison and ordered to repay $847,000 in fraudulent billings. After release, he was restricted from ever practicing medicine in any state. He drove a medical supply van for minimum wage now, making deliveries to clinics and hospitals, a ghost of authority transformed into someone people tried not to look at directly. Laura saw him once, coming off the elevator with boxes of 4 bags. His eyes died when they found hers. He looked away first. The 2-star general came back with a formal proposal in a manila envelope. Would Captain Bennett consider a special assignment? Training the next generation of Special Forces medical personnel? Teaching the techniques she perfected in firefights and blown-out buildings. The letter was waiting in her locker, still unanswered but not refused. She carried it with her like a small stone, something to turn over in her hands during her breaks. Khalid visited weekly. His family came with him sometimes, his wife, his children, his brother, the man whose life Laura had rebuilt piece by piece under fire. They brought food. They brought flowers. They called her the angel, which made her uncomfortable in a way she couldn't quite articulate. Sergeant Webb transferred his care to Seattle General permanently, extended his posting by 6 months, started attending Laura's trauma lectures even though he was technically still on active duty. Connor Davis, the IT specialist, had coffee with her every Thursday at 6 a.m. before shift. They swapped deployment stories. His were from Kandahar. Hers were from places that couldn't be named on official paperwork. A young resident approached the nurse's station on a Tuesday morning. Fresh, nervous, eager in the way people were before they realized how much medicine required you to sit with uncertainty. I'm starting my trauma rotation. Could you teach me that needle decompression technique? The one you did on that veteran. Laura smiled. The first real smile in months. It felt like waking up. Call me Laura, she said. And yes. Show me your hands. The pale blue scrubs hung on her shoulders like they finally fit. Like they'd been waiting for this moment. Outside, Savannah rain continued its eternal conversation with the city, and inside Seattle General, a nurse, a captain, a warrior, a surgeon who'd learned to heal under fire, stood at the threshold of teaching others to do the same. Sometimes the bravest warriors carry stethoscopes, not guns. If you've ever been underestimated or watched someone rise from destruction, please like this video and subscribe for more stories about the quiet heroes who rebuild their lives. Tell us in the comments, What would you have done in Laura's position? Who has underestimated you only to discover they were wrong?